For 5 centuries, nobody could agree on where the Yoruba people actually came from. Historians clashed. Colonial writers invented their own theories to fit their own agendas. Kings pointed to different contradictory legends to justify their thrones. And for all that arguing, nobody had anything harder than folklore and guesswork to settle it. Then scientists cracked open the genome, and the answer they found wasn't just unexpected, it was almost unbelievable. Buried inside the DNA of tens of millions of living people is a fragment of genetic code that doesn't belong to any known human group. It isn't inherited from any culture, any language, any written history. It comes from a species science has never even named, one that left behind no bones, no skeleton, no trace in the ground anywhere on Earth. And yet it's still there, quietly present in people alive today, in some cases making up close to a fifth of their entire genetic makeup. This is how genetics finally answered a 500-year-old question about the Yoruba and stumbled onto something even stranger while doing it. To understand how big this discovery really is, you need to start with a holy city and a legend nobody could ever prove. Back in 2008, when international scientists were building the first ever detailed map of human genetic diversity, they needed a representative population from every major world region. For West Africa, they picked one group above all others, the Yoruba people of Ibadan, Nigeria. In the scientific world, they're simply known by the code YRI, and they've become one of the most studied population samples on the planet. When the following Global Genome Project expanded the work, sequencing thousands of people across dozens of populations and cataloging tens of millions of genetic variants, the Ibadan Yoruba sample remained one of the most cited African datasets in existence. Anytime researchers anywhere needed a West African genetic reference point, there was a good chance they were pulling Yoruba data that mattered enormously, because for most of the 20th century, African populations were badly underrepresented in genetic research, despite the continent holding more human genetic diversity than every other continent combined. It took a deliberate, focused effort to bring West African data up to the same level of detail already available for populations in Europe, East Asia, and beyond. In other words, the tools needed to finally answer the Yoruba origin question didn't even exist for most of modern history, not from lack of curiosity, but because nobody had built the infrastructure yet. And the disagreement this evidence was eventually asked to settle was enormous. The Yoruba are among the largest ethnic groups in Africa, with tens of millions of people across southwestern Nigeria, Benin, and Togo, plus tens of millions more descendants scattered across the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. Their spiritual and cultural traditions survived that forced migration under new names: Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, Orisha, worship across the Caribbean. Deities like Shango, Yamoja, and Oshun are still honored today by communities far from West Africa. By some estimates, more than 100 million people worldwide carry some connection to Yoruba culture or spirituality. So this was never just a regional history question, it's a question with roots on 3 continents. At the center of it all sits one sacred city, Ile-Ife, which Yoruba tradition calls the birthplace of humanity itself. And at the center of Ile-Ife's founding story sits one figure, Oduduwa. Ask where he came from, though, and Yoruba tradition splits into 3 completely different answers. The first is purely spiritual. In this version, Oduduwa was lowered from the heavens by the supreme god Olodumare, carrying only a handful of soil, a 5-toed hen, and a palm seed. As he descended, the hen slipped from his grip. Scrambling to catch it, he dropped the soil instead. Both landed together on the primordial waters covering the earth. The hen scattered the soil across the surface, and wherever it touched, dry land formed, the very ground Ile-Ife would be built on. The palm seed grew into the first tree, its fronds symbolizing the 16 original kingdoms that would descend from Oduduwa's bloodline. In this telling, the Yoruba aren't migrants from anywhere else. They're the origin point for everyone else. The second version comes from Samuel Johnson, a Yoruba Anglican minister who spent decades in the late 1800s compiling oral histories into what became the first major written history of the Yoruba people, published after his death in 1921 and still hugely influential today. Johnson recorded a very different story. Oduduwa as a real historical figure, not a god, who left Mecca after a religious falling out, traveled for roughly 3 months, and arrived at Ile-Ife, carrying idols his homeland had rejected. In this account, the Yoruba nation's founder was an outsider from the Arabian Peninsula who gradually took control over people already living there. The third tradition points somewhere else entirely, ancient Egypt, or the kingdom of Meroe in what is now Sudan. Some early European researchers and a handful of Yoruba historians too propose that Oduduwa and his followers migrated west from the Nile Valley, bringing with them the political and cultural sophistication that would later define Ile-Ife and the wider Yoruba kingdoms. This idea fit neatly into a colonial-era assumption, now thoroughly rejected, that any sufficiently advanced African civilization must have been shaped by lighter-skinned outsiders because indigenous sub-Saharan Africans supposedly couldn't have built it themselves. That bias quietly shaped how European scholars interpreted Yoruba bronze work, city planning, and political organization for decades, long before there was any real evidence to test it against. 3 legends, 3 different points of origin: heaven, Mecca, Egypt. And for centuries there was no way to weigh them against anything but faith and tradition. Long before DNA entered the picture, archaeology had already started poking holes in all 3 stories. Excavations at Ile-Ife uncovered breathtaking bronze and terracotta sculptures, some of the most realistic portrait art produced anywhere in the medieval world, dating roughly from the 11th to the 15th century, a period now called Ife's Classical Age. The casting technique was so refined that early European observers assumed it must have come from outside instruction, an assumption later dismantled once archaeologists found the actual local workshops, tools, and raw materials used to make it. Linguists pushed the timeline back even further, showing that the Yoruba language had likely been developing in place for well over 2,000 years, evolving out of earlier populations already settled in the forest region of what's now southwestern Nigeria, with Ile-Ife itself possibly taking shape as early as the 5th century BCE. Instead of a single outside founder arriving to civilize an empty land, the picture that emerged was a civilization that grew in place over an enormous span of time, absorbing outside influence without being founded by it. But archaeology and linguistics could only go so far. They couldn't answer the most basic biological question of all. Where did the ancestors of the Yoruba actually come from genetically? Were they, as 2 of the legends claimed, relatively recent arrivals from North Africa or the Middle East, layered on top of an existing population? Or did their ancestry run deep and local, with no significant outside mixing at all? Only DNA could settle that.
The first clue came from mitochondrial DNA, genetic material passed down only through the maternal line, changing very slowly over thousands of years. A detailed study of 71 Yoruba individuals found 65 distinct maternal genetic lineages, giving an extremely high diversity score, among the highest ever recorded for any studied population. That's consistent with a basic fact of human genetics. Since modern humans originated in Africa, African populations have simply had far longer to accumulate genetic diversity than anyone else on Earth. But diversity alone doesn't answer the origin question. What mattered was how Yoruba genetics compared to their neighbors. Geneticists use a measure called FST to score genetic separation between two groups. Near zero means barely distinguishable. Higher values mean a longer history of separation. When researchers compared the Yoruba sample to a broader Nigerian data set, the difference was statistically insignificant. Compared to a nearby population in Ghana, same result, barely distinguishable. On the maternal line, in other words, Yoruba ancestry blends almost seamlessly into the surrounding West African genetic landscape. No sign of a separate lineage suddenly appearing from Arabia or the Nile. A second study compared 5 major Nigerian ethnic groups, Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Tiv, and Efik, using genetic markers similar to the kind used in forensic and paternity testing, drawn from 250 participants across the country. Yoruba and Igbo came back as the most genetically similar pairing in the entire study, more similar to each other, in fact, than the geographically neighboring Igbo and Efik groups were to one another. A reminder that living close together doesn't automatically mean sharing more DNA. When researchers ran a full statistical breakdown across all 5 groups, the numbers were striking. Nearly 99.9% of all genetic variation existed between individual people, regardless of ethnicity. And only about 0.1% could be attributed to differences between entire ethnic groups. In practice, that means 2 random Yoruba people are likely to show more genetic difference from each other than the average Yoruba person shows compared to the average Hausa, Igbo, or Tiv person. Ethnic identity in Nigeria is real and powerful, built on language, tradition, and history. But at the genome level, these populations sit remarkably close together. That finding quietly undercuts both the Mecca and Egypt theories, since either would require Yoruba ancestry to look meaningfully distinct from its neighbors because of a relatively recent outside founding migration. The genome shows the opposite: deep, long-running continuity. A third study added an unexpected twist. Researchers examined both maternal and paternal genetic markers across Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo populations, over 350 individuals combined. All 3 groups shared a broadly similar maternal genetic background, consistent with a long-standing cultural pattern where women historically moved to join their husband's community. But the paternal line told a different story. Yoruba and Igbo, both speakers of Niger-Congo languages, showed paternal ancestry aligned with other Niger-Congo-speaking populations, regardless of geography. Hausa, whose language belongs to the unrelated Afro-Asiatic family, showed paternal ancestry more closely tied to other Afro-Asiatic-speaking groups across the continent, along with noticeably more paternal lineage diversity overall. That detail matters because both Arabic and ancient Egyptian belong to the Afro-Asiatic language family. If Yoruba paternal ancestry had significant roots in Mecca or the Nile Valley, you'd expect at least some genetic pull toward that same Afro-Asiatic cluster, the way Hausa ancestry shows. It doesn't. Yoruba paternal lineages sit firmly inside the Niger-Congo genetic and linguistic cluster, reinforcing exactly what the maternal data already suggested: deep, local West African roots, not a recent arrival from Arabia or Egypt. By this point, genetics had done something 500 years of legend, colonial theorizing, and archaeological debate never managed. It didn't just favor one origin story over the other 2. It moved past all 3, replacing them with a picture of long, continuous, in-place development, stretching back thousands of years, deeply woven into the wider fabric of West African peoples. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. In February 2020, two researchers from the University of Southern California published a study that, on the surface, had nothing to do with Ile-Ife, Oduduwa, or the last 2,000 years of history at all. Here's something most people outside genetics don't know. People with European, Asian, or Oceanian ancestry today carry roughly 1 to 4% Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA. Genetic leftovers from ancient interbreeding as modern humans spread out of Africa and encountered these other archaic human race